He preached an end to violence and stood trial for murder. The crazy case of William Polo Edwards, the man who preached peace. William Polo Edwards was a well-known figure in his community primarily for his advocacy of nonviolence and peace. For years, Edwards had been an outspoken advocate against violence in all its forms. As a community leader, he frequently gave lectures, participated in peace rallies, and worked with local organizations to promote harmony. His charisma and sincerity made him a respected voice in his town. He was the kind of person who seemed to understand the power of words and actions. His advocacy was not just philosophical. Edwards had spent years in rehabilitation programs, working with at-risk youth to divert them from violent lifestyles. His message was simple. Peace was the answer to all of society's problems. His strong stance against violence earned him admiration, but it also left many perplexed when the shocking details of his arrest came to light. In a tragic twist, the very man who had devoted his life to preaching an end to violence would soon find himself at the center of a murder investigation. It was a stunning contradiction to the life he had built and left many questioning how someone who advocated so fervently for peace could become a suspect in a violent crime. A violent crime unfolds. The story that unfolded on the night of the crime was nothing short of chilling. On an evening that seemed like any other, William Polo Edwards found himself caught in a violent altercation that would end in tragedy. The details surrounding the crime were as murky as they were terrifying. Edwards had gone to meet a man named Robert Davis, who by all accounts was a close associate of Edwards for several years. The two had shared a professional relationship, but their personal ties remained limited. That night, something went terribly wrong. According to witnesses, Edwards and Davis had a heated exchange that escalated quickly. Several individuals who were nearby reported hearing loud arguing before the situation turned physical. What started as a verbal dispute turned into a violent confrontation when Edwards allegedly lashed out at Davis. In a shocking turn of events, Davis was found dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, and Edwards was quickly identified as the main suspect in the murder. The motive behind the murder. In the immediate aftermath of Robert Davis' death, investigators began searching for a motive. At first glance, the crime seemed entirely out of character for Edwards. He had no history of violent behavior, and many in the community had never seen him display any sort of aggression. This raised the question, why would someone who had devoted so much of his life to peace suddenly commit such an atrocious act? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the motive may have been linked to a long-standing personal dispute between Edwards and Davis. It was revealed that Davis had been involved in some shady business dealings, many of which Edwards had grown increasingly uncomfortable with. In fact, Edwards had been working for years to distance himself from Davis' criminal activities. However, the two remained connected through business and social ties. Edwards had allegedly confronted Davis over his involvement in a scheme that Edwards found morally reprehensible. It appeared that Davis had crossed a line that, according to Edwards, could not be ignored. While this didn't excuse the violence, it provided investigators with a potential explanation for the escalation. Edwards' surprising confession. After his arrest, Edwards shocked the public by confessing to the crime. The confession was full of emotion and regret, revealing that Edwards was deeply conflicted about what had happened. According to his statements to the police, Edwards had never intended for the altercation to turn violent. He described how an argument initially about Davis' criminal activities spiraled out of control. Edwards admitted that he had been pushed to the brink by Davis' manipulative behavior and lack of remorse for his actions. In an emotional recounting, Edwards said that in the heat of the argument, he lost control of his temper. "I never meant for it to go this far," he explained, "but in that moment, I just snapped." This confession did not offer a complete explanation for the violence, and many were left wondering whether his regret was genuine or whether it was simply a reaction to the consequences of his actions. Despite his claims of remorse, the facts of the case painted a different picture. Edwards had taken to life, a stark contradiction to everything he had preached in the years leading up to the murder. Community reactions, the betrayal of trust. The news of Edwards' arrest sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once seen him as a beacon of hope and a pillar of peace now struggled to reconcile his teachings with the brutal crime he had committed. How could someone who had worked tirelessly for peace be capable of such violence? The betrayal of trust was palpable, and many were left questioning the authenticity of this public persona. Edwards' role in the community had been one of a leader, a guide, and a source of inspiration for many, particularly the youth he had mentored over the years. His sudden fall from grace left many feeling disillusioned, unsure of how to handle the situation. Some close friends and colleagues tried to explain Edwards' actions by emphasizing his years of work for peace, while others believed the crime revealed a darker side to his character that had been hidden for years. As the investigation continued, the divided opinions about Edwards became even more pronounced. Some believed his remorse was genuine, while others saw him as a fraud. The case began to highlight the complexities of human behavior. and how even the most dedicated advocates of peace could sometimes harbor violent tendencies beneath the surface. The trial, a public spectacle. When William Polo Edwards' trial began, it quickly became a media sensation. His once sterling reputation was now in tatters, and the public's fascination with his fall from grace only deepened. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom were eager to witness the trial of the man who had preached nonviolence, but was now standing accused of murder. The defense team argued that Edwards was a man who had been pushed beyond his limits and had acted in a moment of rage. They painted him as a victim of circumstances, someone who had tried to live by the principles of peace but had been dragged into a violent situation by Davis' criminal behavior. Edwards' lawyer emphasized that the crime was not premeditated, and that Edwards was genuinely remorseful for what he had done. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted Edwards as a man who had allowed his frustration and anger to override his moral compass. They argued that the murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the result of Edwards' failure to control his emotions. The case soon became a battle of conflicting narratives, one side depicting Edwards as a well-intentioned man who lost control, and the other as a man who had turned violent despite his peace-loving rhetoric. Psychological profiling and the role of anger. During the trial, experts were brought in to analyze Edwards' psychological state. Was he truly a peaceful advocate, or did his actions indicate that his passion for nonviolence was nothing more than a facade? Psychologists began to explore the possibility that Edwards had been struggling with deep internal conflicts for years. It was suggested that Edwards had long suppressed his feelings of anger, only for them to explode under the right conditions. His inability to deal with these emotions may have led to a delayed and violent outburst. The prosecution argued that Edwards' tendency to suppress negative feelings while publicly preaching peace may have created a psychological pressure cooker that eventually erupted in violence. The experts also noted that Edwards' feelings toward Davis had grown increasingly hostile over time. His frustration with Davis' disregard for the principles he had spent years promoting may have played a significant role in the murder. The verdict: guilty of manslaughter. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. William Polo Edwards was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury concluded that while Edwards had indeed caused Davis' death, his actions were not premeditated and were the result of an emotional outburst rather than a calculated crime. The manslaughter conviction carried a lesser sentence, but it still left Edwards facing significant jail time. Many felt that the verdict was a reflection of the complex nature of the case. Edwards had undoubtedly committed a crime, but the circumstances surrounding it were far from straightforward. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some believed that manslaughter was an appropriate charge, given Edwards' remorse and the lack of premeditation. Others felt that the crime was more severe than the jury had acknowledged and that Edwards should have faced a murder conviction. Reflections on peace and violence. In the aftermath of the trial, Edwards reflected on his actions and the contrast between the life he had led and the crime he had committed. He expressed deep regret for his actions and stated that he would dedicate the rest of his life to trying to make amends for the harm he had caused. Edwards continued to speak out about peace, though his words now carried an air of caution. The case forced many in the community to reevaluate their understanding of violence and human nature. It underscored the idea that even those who dedicate their lives to advocating for peace are not immune to the complex emotions and behaviors that can lead to violent actions. Edwards' crime was a painful reminder that human beings are imperfect, and even the most well-intentioned individuals can falter. The legacy of William Polo Edwards. In the years following his conviction, Edwards continued to serve his sentence, but his story was far from over. He became a cautionary tale for others, a reminder that actions speak louder than words. The case left a lasting impression on the community, sparking conversations about the fine line between preaching nonviolence and truly living it. Edwards' legacy was forever tarnished by the crime, but some still saw him as a man who had tried, despite his flaws, to do good in the world. The William Polo Edwards case remains a tragic example of the complexities of human nature and the unpredictable consequences of unresolved emotional conflicts. Despite his efforts to promote peace, Edwards' own inability to reconcile his emotions led to a violent outcome that shocked everyone who had once believed in him.